And so I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, malik yawm ad-din, iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim wa lad-dallin, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله ولا أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين. أما بعد، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك، عليكم منا جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقينا وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد منا لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Peace be upon you, O Aba Abdullah, and upon the souls who have gathered in your courtyard. Upon you from us is the peace of God forever, for as long as we remain and as long as night and day endure. And may God never make this our last pledge to visit you. Peace be upon Al-Husayn, and upon Ali, the son of Husayn, and upon the children of Husayn, and upon the companions of Husayn. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we've had 5 nights of foundation. On the first night, we recovered a word, Shahada, which is not victimhood, but instead is witness, with the cost of witnessing borne in the body. On the second night, we traced the chain from Abel through the prophets from the children of Israel into the family of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon them all. On the third night, we entered the theology of the candle, Shaykh Mutahhari's metaphor, may God rest his pure soul, and his 5 kinds of death. On the fourth night, we heard Imam Husayn's diagnosis at Mina and the 3 silences, fear, comfort, and the narrowing of moral vision. And last night, we stood at the shared ground and the divergences between the Christian witness and our own. And we named the methodology that would carry us forward, honor without conflation. Tonight, we leave the religious neighborhood entirely, and we enter and look at the secular one. And we begin with a confession. If the wretched of the earth went looking for liberation outside the mosque in the 20th century, the question is not only why they went, it is why the mosque had stopped offering them anything to come back to. And the question is larger still. The failure was not a Muslim failure alone. It was a failure across all 3 Abrahamic houses, in different ways certainly, in the same decades. The verse that hangs over the night is from Surah Al-Baqarah. And that is, of course, the chapter of the cow, 2nd chapter of the Quran, verse 154. And the verse is, "Do not say of those slain in the way of God that they are dead. Rather, they are alive, but you perceive it not." Now, the qualifier here matters more than the rest of the verse. Fi sabilillah, in the way of God. Many were slain in the 20th, in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. The verse names the road. Tonight we ask who walked it and who paved it. The question we will spend the night asking is, whose road were they on? Please give me a salawat and we move to the first point, which is why the wretched went elsewhere.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
So let's set the scene. The mid-20th century, the colonial and post-colonial world bleeding. Algeria, 8 years of war from 1954. Vietnam, the fight against the French and then against the Americans. Cuba, the revolution of 1959 against an empire's client regime. And Palestine, the Nakba in 1948, and every catastrophe that followed it. The map of the global south, country after country, holding ground that had been bought and sold over their heads for 2 centuries and more by powers they had never asked to govern them. A generation of young people then, whose grandparents had been farmers under empire, whose fathers had fought, often as conscripts, in someone else's wars. The young people of that generation looked around at the world that had been handed to them, and they asked the only question that was worth asking. What do we do with our bodies, our lives, the dignity that has been taken? And they asked, and as they asked, they looked at the religious houses around them, the mosques, the churches, and the synagogues. And what they found in too many places was silence, or comfort, or dogma, or worse. They looked elsewhere because they had to. The fault is not theirs alone. Tonight we will name three houses: the Christian, the Jewish, and our own, gently and as a self-critique. We honor the prophetic root in each. We name the suffering each people endured, and we name with care where each drifted. Then we lift the question off communities and onto persons, because the question of who failed and who did not is, at the end of the day, never a question about peoples. It is a question about choices. And the model lives in our own caravan. Hur ibn Yazid blocked the caravan and turned. Umar ibn Sa'ad faced the same caravan and chose Ray and ultimately the fire. Both men faced the same caravan, both had the same choice, and both made it. We're not here to indict communities. We're here to honor every hur in every tradition, be it Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and yes, even secular, and to set ourselves the same choice tonight. So the first house that we approach is the Christian house, and we approach it as we did last night, honoring what God has honored. The chain of Christian witness is real. We spoke of it last night. Polycarp of Smyrna, refusing to curse Christ at the stake. Perpetua of Carthage, killed in the arena. Justin the philosopher. Franz Jagerstatter, beheaded at Brandenburg in 1943 for refusing the Weihmacht oath. The 21 Coptic men on a Libyan beach in February 2015. Oscar Romero, killed at the altar in San Salvador in 1980, mid-sentence with the chalice in his hand. And of course, Shireen Abu Akleh, whose name we will mention again tonight, because she sits in the geometry of every paragraph in this sermon. The chain is real. We do not unsay it. And yet, the institutional Christian house did not meet its prophetic moment in the mid-20th century. The Catholic Church entered and emerged from the world wars in great confusion. Pope Pius XII's contested record of silence during the Holocaust. The institutional drift that allowed too many priests and bishops in country after country to lend the authority of the church to the regimes of the likes of Mussolini, Franco, Pétain, and the long succession of dictatorships in Latin America. Vatican II in the early 1960s was a partial corrective, shall we say, that came far too late. And even after Vatican II, liberation theology had to be pushed into existence at Medellin in 1968 by bishops who had had enough, because the absence of a prophetic Christianity in the colonial decades had been so unbearable to so many. This is the institutional drift, and we name it. And the line that lands the move, the colonized man who would soon write The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon, raised Catholic in Martinique, was raised in the church that gave him no theology of liberation that he could use. We will return to him in point 2. The colonized young men and women of Algeria, of Cuba, of Vietnam, of Palestine looked at the church standing too often beside the empire that was breaking their bodies, and they did the only honest thing that they could. They looked elsewhere. And now we look at the second house. And we approach this house, which is, of course, the Jewish house, and we approach it with the patience that the subject demands. Long before any of the catastrophes that we will name, this house gave the world Moses, peace and blessings be upon him. The prophet who stood before Pharaoh, who spoke with God on Sinai, who led a people out of the most powerful empire of his age. It gave us Aaron or Harun, the patient brother. It gave us the long line of the prophets of justice, the likes of Elijah, Isaiah, Amos, Micah, whose denunciations of the kings of their own people are some of the most fearless prophetic speech that the world has ever known. It gave us the Maccabees, who refused to bow to Antioch IV in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And it gave us the great rabbis of every century who upheld justice when justice was costly. And we honor each and every one of them. Indeed, the Quran is the most generous text in the world towards the prophets from the children of Israel. Surah Al-Baqarah opens a sustained meditation on the covenant given at Sinai. Surah Al-Imran weaves the lineage of the prophets from the children of Israel into the lineage of the Messiah. And Surah Maryam shows our own Saint Mary, said Maryam, peace and blessings be upon her, addressed by an angel in the same words the Hebrew prophets had been addressed for 15 centuries prior to her. They are our siblings in the prophetic family. Any sermon that speaks of the Jewish house must begin and end with that honor, or it's not worth giving. Because we cannot understand what comes next without naming what was done to these people in the centuries before the 20th. Christian Europe, and let us name this precisely, because what was done to the Jewish people in Europe was a Christian failure, not a Jewish one. They inherited an ancient prejudice. It was systematized theologically, and over 1500 years perfected the machinery of the real definition of anti-Semitism, not the one that's conflated with anti-Zionism. Let's make that very clear. You have the accusation of the killing of God. You have the blood libels of the medieval centuries. You have the ghettos of Venice, Rome, and Frankfurt. You have the pogroms of the Russian Pale. You have the Dreyfus Affair in France of 1894. And you have the slow, grinding ostracism of Jewish populations across 19th century Europe. And then you have the Holocaust. Jewish lives extinguished in industrial murder. Now, the figure most often cited is 6 million. Historians dispute the precise number. What is documented by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is the total Holocaust death toll of approximately 17,383,900 souls. The Nazi murder program was vastly wider than the Jewish suffering alone. This needs to be made very clear. Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, by every honest count, far more numerous in the Nazi machinery than the Jewish dead, somewhere in the order of 12 million on careful estimates. Poles, Roma, and Sinti, the disabled, in the program the Nazis themselves called Action T4. Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissenters, homosexuals. The targeting of Jewish people was singular in its systematic intent, in its industrial completeness, and we honor that singularity. But the catastrophe was wider, and the Jewish dead belong within that wider catastrophe, not detached from it. To isolate the Holocaust, as some people do, to a single religious grouping is itself a violation of the dead, be they Jewish or non-Jewish alike. What happened in Europe in those years was humanity killing humanity, and tragically, this continues to this day. especially in the West Asia region. We honor the Jewish portion fully, and we refuse the framing that erases the rest. We have to also be honest about how a people who endured what the Jewish people endured in the 1940s came to make the choices that they made in the years that followed. They were a people abandoned. Christian Europe had spent 15 centuries calling them the killers of God, and then 5 years killing them. The world stood by. In the late 1930s and the late 1940s, the world stood by doing what amounted to nothing while the trains rolled into Treblinka. And then at the end of the war, an offer arrived. And this is important. An offer arrived. A Western empire, the same British Empire whose Balfour Declaration of 1917 had laid the groundwork and whose mandate had administered the land for 30 years since, presented them with the prospect of a state in a land already inhabited by another people who would bear the cost of the gift. Let us be honest about what the offer was. The empire was not redeeming the Jewish people for the catastrophe in which it itself had been complicit. The empire, and this is important, the empire was using their trauma as an instrument for its own colonial calculus in the Levant region. A portion of the Jewish community, not all, but a politically dominant portion, accepted the offer. And on the wreckage of the Palestinian Nakba of 1948, an ethno-national project was built. Over the decades that followed, this project gradually substituted, in too many official mouths, the prophetic covenant of Sinai for a tribal chosen people theology that the prophets themselves had spent centuries attempting to dismantle. The proverbial golden calf made this time of fear instead of gold, but a calf nonetheless. The covenant of Moses with the God of justice replaced in the dominant idiom of the new state by a doctrine of ethnic exclusivity that no prophet from the children of Israel ever taught, and that every prophet from the children of Israel preached and fought against. Chosenness, which has always been a burden of justice, was quietly traded for a shield of ethnicity. The cost has been borne daily for nearly 80 years by the Palestinian people, by the Lebanese people, by the people of the West Asia region, by the integrity of the Jewish prophetic tradition itself, and by the trust of every neighbor the new state has inherited. Before we leave this house, we pause to name those who refuse to look away. We might say they are the horrors of the Jewish tradition, and they matter. You have, for example, Hannah Arendt, whose later misgivings about political Zionism cost her the friendship of much of her community and made her ostracized for the simple act of insisting that Jewish life is bigger than the Israeli state. You have Marek Edelman, the Bund commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, who refused to migrate to the new state because he saw what it would become, and who remained in Poland for the rest of his life. You have Rabbi Elmer Berger, who founded the American Council for Judaism in 1942 to insist that Judaism is a faith, not a nationalism and not an ethnos. You have the Nutra Carter, who for 80 years have refused at great cost the entire premise of the state on theological grounds from the faith of Judaism. And the historians, the Israeli historians of the 1980s and onwards, who have done the hard work of telling the truth from the inside, the likes of Ilan Pappé, Norman Finkelstein, Avi Shleim, Shlomo Sand, truth tellers from the inside who have paid for their truth telling. And the figure who still lives with us, Shireen Abu Akleh, a Christian Palestinian journalist killed by an Israeli sniper in Jenin on the 11th of May, 2022, while wearing very clearly a vest that was very, very obviously marked press. We named her in last night's session, and we name her again now because she sits at exactly the geometry of this session. A Christian Palestinian who covered the violence of a state operating in the name of Jewish chosenness. Killed by that state, mourned in the same week by Christians and Muslims together. Palestine is the place where the failure of all three houses converges into a single open wound. And Shireen is the witness whose witness was killed. We honor them all. We grieve them all. And we speak the name of the Jewish house tonight without shame and without flattery, because that is what the prophets of that house, our prophets also, would have demanded of us. And so now we come to the third house, and this is by far the most painful because it is our own. The same plague that Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, diagnosed in the khutbah of Mina at the start of his rising, applied now to the Muslim world in the mid-20th century and arguably to this day. The three silences from night 4, fear, comfort, and the narrowing of moral vision, were not a one-off 7th century pathology. They were the standing temptation of every religious community in every age. And they had unfortunately taken hold of much of the Muslim world in the decades when the wretched of the earth were looking desperately for an answer. Look at the record. The Arab catastrophe of 1948, the Suez Crisis of 1956, the Six-Day War of 1967, where in less than a week, that same settler colonial entity seized the Sinai, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam. And the official scholarly establishments of the Arab Muslim world, in country after country, had nothing to say but make mournful prayers. Each humiliation was more total than the one that came before it. What was on offer instead? Pan-Arabism. Jamal Abdel Nasser's Pan-Arabism. Secular, ethnically narrow, theologically bankrupt and empty. But the only revolutionary slogan in the Sunni Arab world for more than 2 decades. A nationalism without the prophets. A liberation without God. And let me rephrase that. It wasn't the Sunni Arab world, it was the Muslim world per se. These kind of slogans the empire can absorb, because these slogans offer them no chance of real challenge, no transcendent challenge. And in the mosques themselves, what had Islam become? In too many mosques, in too many cities, Islam had been reduced to the niceties of personal purity, to ablution, to the angle of the slaughtering knife, to the corner cases of menstruation and travel, and these trivialities, to kitchen and shoes. While the prophetic command to enjoin the good and forbid the evil, to stand against tyranny, to be witnesses for God even against ourselves, lay forgotten on the shelves. The covenant of kuntum khayra ummatin, you were the best of communities, was being recited every Friday without the conditional that follows it, and we'll come to that momentarily. This is the kitchen and shoes Islam that Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, thundered against from his exile. This is the Islam Imam al-Husayn went to Karbala to refuse. And the wretched of the earth saw it, and they reached past it, and we cannot blame them for reaching. Now, there were Muslims who tried, and we owe them a fair word. In Egypt, you had Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Ismailiyya in 1928, who built a real mass movement out of the mosques and schools and labor cooperatives, and who was assassinated by the Egyptian secret police in February of 1949. You have Sayyid Qutb, whose Milestones, published in 1964, was the most rigorous Sunni Islamic critique of modern Jahiliyyah or modern ignorance of its decade, and who in 1966 was hanged by the Nasser regime. Now, whatever we make of the Muslim Brotherhood's later trajectory, or of the takfiri turn that took hold of some of Sayyid Qutb's successors, and we will return to that again in session 9, the period itself had two figures who tried, and they paid for it with their lives. The honor is real. In Najaf, you had Shaheed Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, may God rest his pure soul, who was working on falsafuna, our philosophy, and iqtisaduna, our economics. Falsafuna was published in 1959, iqtisaduna, our economics, was published in 61. A real Islamic answer to Hegelian philosophy and Marxist economics, written in Arabic, exactly when the wretched of the earth desperately needed it. They didn't see him either. In Iran, the man who would change the calculus had not yet risen publicly. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, was still a relatively young scholar in Qom. The 15th of Khordad, 1342 of the Solar Hijri, around June 1963, when Imam Khomeini led the resistance to the Shah's so-called White Revolution and then was arrested, and when those who defended him were massacred in the streets, that was 2 years away from the moment Fanon's book was being printed. His exile to Turkey, Imam Khomeini's exile to Turkey in 1964, his move to Najaf in 1965, his Najaf lectures of 1969 and 1970 that became the foundation of Hukumat al-Islami, the Islamic government, the theory of Wilayat al-Faqih, all of that lay ahead. And here's the theological note that we should carry away from this. Witness precedes theory in the prophetic tradition. Imam Husayn did not write a book. He went to Karbala. He completed the Hujjah, he went to Karbala. Imam Sajjad and Sayyid Zainab, peace and blessings be upon them, wrote the book of Karbala after. The young scholar in Qom and then in exile in Najaf was already at his Karbala. The framework of his theory would follow his witness. And Imam Khomeini's diagnosis, when it came to be written, was the same diagnosis Imam Husayn had made back at Mina. And notice that he uses very nearly the same image that you and I have been using these past few sessions. From his first lecture in the Husayniyya of Najaf on the 21st of January 1970, Imam Khomeini said, and I quote, and the references of course are all in the write-up, "Islam must be presented to the people in its true form, so that our youth do not imagine the religious scholars, the so-called akhond, the quietist clergy, sitting in some corner of Najaf or Qom, studying only the questions of menstruation and postnatal purity, as if they had nothing to do with politics. Islam has a program for every aspect of life. Islam is a political religion, and the religious scholars must learn politics from Islam, not take their Islam from Western and Eastern politicians." More than 45 decades before this majlis, the same Imam who would lead the Islamic Revolution of 1979 was diagnosing the kitchen and shoes Islam from his exile in Najaf. The same critique, the same target, and exactly the same tradition. And listen to his final line. This is very interesting. "The religious scholars must learn politics from Islam and not take their Islam from Western or Eastern politicians." Because this sentence, spoken in Najaf in a classroom in 1970, is the seed of the slogan the revolution would chant years later. Na Sharqi na Gharbi Jamhuriya Islami. Neither East nor West, Islamic Republic. The candle was already shaped before it was raised. The Wretched of the Earth in 1961 saw a man under house arrest, then a man in exile, then no man at all. They could be forgiven for not seeing what was coming. And you also have Shaykh Mutahari and Dr. Ali Shariati, may God rest their pure souls, who were still gathering their materials. The candle had been refound, but it had not yet been raised. The Wretched of the Earth could not see the dawn breaking in the mountains around Qom and Najaf and Tehran. They saw the long night still on the plain. And they saw what was on the table. And what was on the table was Fanon. Please give me a salawat, and we cover a very important point now. Chosenness is not a possession, rather it is a burden.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So now that we've covered the three houses, and before we come to Fanon, we have to ask a diagnostic question that runs across all three houses. What is chosenness in the language of Quran? Because the deformation each house drifted into is the same deformation. And the cure where it has been administered is the same cure. Let's consider the negative side first. Chosenness is not an ethnic category. The moment any community, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, turns chosenness into a possession of blood or soil or lineage, it has done something with terrible theological consequences. What is that? It has made God ethnocentric. And an ethnocentric God, by definition, cannot be just. Because if he favors one race over another, he must, by definition, be unjust to those he did not favor. And an unjust God is no God at all. The notion of adl ilahi, divine justice, is one of our main roots of religion, what we call usul ad-din, that we have covered in our Wednesday sessions on the Lantern of the Path. One of the 5 constitutive principles of the faith in the Shiite tradition. Not one attribute amongst many, a principle, a core principle of his nature, alongside Tawheed, prophethood, the Imamah, and the Day of Judgment. If you pull the justice of God down, then Tawheed falls with it. The very claim to be the chosen people of God collapses the moment chosenness is taken as ethnic. The very form refutes itself. Now, this diagnosis lands hardest in the Jewish house that we have just visited, but it lands on us first. The grammar of kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrajat linnas, which I will come to momentarily, is grammatically conditioned on what follows. تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْحَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. That you enjoin good, you forbid evil, and you believe in God. You drop the conditional, and the Muslim community has performed the same drift we are diagnosing in our prophetic siblings. The condition is performative, not ontological. God's mercy does not depend on us. Our station as witnesses does. In Quran, Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran, verse 110, is the verse I've mentioned a couple of times now. Kuntum khayra ummatin. You were the best of communities brought forth for humanity. You enjoin the good, forbid the evil, and you believe in God. The Quran's clearest critique of chosenness as possession is the parable of the donkey carrying books in Surah Al-Jum'ah. In Quran, Surah Al-Jum'ah, the chapter of the Friday, chapter 62 of the Quran, verse number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the likeness of those who were entrusted with the Torah and then did not carry it is as the likeness of a donkey carrying volumes of books. And let's listen to how Allama Tabatabai, may God rest his pure soul, in his famous tafsir or exegesis of the Quran, Al-Mizan, reads this verse, because the move he makes is exactly the move our methodology requires. He names the historical referent of the verse plainly, he does not flinch. And then he turns the simile back as a warning on the Muslim community itself. Allama writes, and of course the references are all in the write-up. Allama writes, the intended referent of those who were charged with the Torah and then did not carry it is the Jews. Those upon whose messenger Moses, peace and blessings be upon him, God sent down the Torah, who taught them what it contained of the teachings and the laws, and they abandoned it and did not act in accordance with it. They carried it and did not carry it. So God struck for them the simile of the donkey carrying books. And so God objected by means of this simile and reminded the Muslims of the condition of the Jews, those who were charged with the Torah and did not carry it. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the Muslims to be concerned with the matter of religion, and let them beware lest there befall upon them of God's wrath what befell the Jews, when the Jews failed to act on what they knew. So God counted them as ignorant and oppressive and likened them to a donkey carrying books. Think about and reflect on what Allama Tabatabai is doing. The verse names the Jews as its historical referent, and Allama does not soften that. But the same simile is then turned in the same paragraph of his commentary back towards the Muslims. Let them beware lest there befall upon them what befell the Jews. The donkey of the parable is the historical Israel of Moses' time, and any community after them that is entrusted with revelation and reduces it to a burden carried without understanding. That is the covenantal reading. The simile is universal in its theological force, even where its historical referent is specific. The Muslim who recites the Quran without enacting it, the Christian who recites the Sermon on the Mount without standing against the empire, the Jew who recites the Torah without standing against the pharaohs of every age, are the donkeys of the books they carry. The image cuts across all three houses, and it cuts deepest when it cuts at us. And now the affirmative side. What chosenness actually is when it is rightly understood. It is the active duty to enjoin good and forbid evil. In Quran, Surah At-Tawbah, the chapter of the repentance, 9th chapter of the Quran, verse number 71, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the believing men and believing women are protectors of one another. They enjoin the good and they forbid the evil. It is the witness against the self when justice demands it. And listen carefully, because this verse returns in the bridge to point 2. Quran, Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of the women, 4th chapter of the Quran, verse 135. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, be upholders of justice, witnesses for God, even against yourselves or your parents and relatives. It is the Quran's own answer to the question, who is the best? Not a tribe or a lineage, but those who imitate the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his family, and his righteous companions. In Quran, Surah Al-Ahzab, the chapter of the Confederates, 33rd chapter of the Quran, verse 21. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed, in the messenger of God, you have an excellent example for whoever seeks God and the last day and remembers God much. Closeness is achieved. It is not inherited. And it is the cosmopolitan vocation. Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat, the chapter of the apartments or the chambers, 49th chapter of the Quran, verse number 13. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, O humanity, we have created you from a male and a female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most God-conscious. Difference is not a problem to be solved. Difference is the ground on which mutual knowing, ta'aruf, becomes possible. We are chosen to know one another, not to wall ourselves off from one another. So hear the line we walk with for the rest of this night. Chosenness is not a possession to be defended. Rather, it is a burden to be carried. The moment any community confuses the two, it ceases to be chosen. Even if it keeps singing about it for centuries and even millennia. Please give me a salawat and we move to the next point. Hur across the stand, Omar chose Ray. The choice is always now.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Whatever happened to the institutions, the choice has always been individual, and the choice is always now. Hur ibn Yazid blocked the caravan and turned. We heard about him in the Maqtal yesterday. Umar ibn Sa'ad faced the same caravan, yet he chose Ray and the fire of hell. We heard both stories last night, as I said. Hur stepping across the open stand, laying his shield upside down, asking, "Will you accept my repentance?" And Umar ibn Sa'ad sitting in the same desert and counting the lands that he had been promised. Tonight we lift the lesson off them and onto every soul that has ever stood at the edge of the same kind of choice. Within every house, in every century, both choices have been available. The Christian who became Jagerstatter and the Christian who put on the SS uniform both face the same field. The Jew who became Marek Edelman and the Jew who enforced the occupation both face the same field. And the Muslim who walked with Imam Husayn at Karbala and the Muslim who pulled the bowstring against him both face the same field. Listen to the verse of Quran that I mentioned earlier just for a moment again. Again, this is from Surah An-Nisa, chapter of the women, 4th chapter of the Quran, verse 135. O you who believe, be upholders of justice, witnesses for God, even against yourselves. That verse made Hur. He bore witness for God against himself, against the army that he had led, against the orders that he had been given, against the path that he had been on. He is Surah An-Nisa, verse 135, made flesh in a single morning in the open sand of Karbala. And if it can make any of us on any morning in any field when the choice is set before us. We're not here to indict communities. We're here to honor Hur, every Hur in every tradition, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and as I said previously, yes, even secular, and to set ourselves the same choice tonight. Be witnesses for God, even against ourselves. The verse means what it says. And this is the point from the main first point to the second point. The first point has just told us why the wretched went elsewhere. Point 2 will now meet them where they went and ask with the same compassion what they found there. If the choice is individual, then the question becomes, what vocabulary did the 20th century give to those who chose to stand? Please give me a loud salawat and we move on to the second point by starting with Marx in A Heartless World.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Now hear me carefully, because the figure I'm about to bring into this sermon, into this majlis, is one whose name has often been used as a curse within the Muslim community for as long as most of us have been alive. This is Karl Marx. born in Trier in the Rhineland in 1818, descended on both sides from rabbis, raised secular, dead in London in 1883. The standard atheist reading of Marx clips a famous phrase off the head of a longer sentence and produces a one-line dismissal. The standard Muslim reaction to that one-line dismissal is to bury Marx without ever having even heard him. We will do neither tonight. From a piece of writing Marx published in February of 1844, in a small German-French journal in Paris, comes the most quoted and least understood sentence in the entire history of 19th century European thought. Karl Marx wrote, and the reference of course is all in the write-up, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." Think about that full sentence again. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, not the oppressor, the oppressed, the one who has nothing else. The heart of a heartless world. Marx is acknowledging over here that religion gives a heart to a world that is otherwise heartless. He is not dismissing religion as nothing. The soul of soulless conditions, the smoke and the lung disease and the children working in the factories of Manchester and the Ruhr. Religion is the soul of those soulless conditions. And then it is the opium of the people. Now the atheist reading lands on those last few words alone and stops there. But that's not what Marx is actually saying. Marx's critique is something else entirely. That religion, as it has come to function in his Lutheran, Hegelian, Christian milieu, has become a sedative for suffering rather than a transformer of the conditions that caused it. Marx wants the heartless world transformed so that the consolation is not necessary. He wants the cause of the suffering removed, not the consolation removed. Look at the diagnosis again. Listen to it as it is the diagnosis Imam Husayn made at Mina. It is the diagnosis that Shaykh Mutahhari made in his book, The Martyr. It is the diagnosis Imam Khomeini made in Islamic government, in Hukumat Islami. Religion that has lost its connection with God has become the opiate of those who adhere to it, has become a sedative. Marx and the prophets are looking at the same phenomenon. The difference between them is which side of the diagnosis each is speaking from. Marx made the same diagnosis our prophets and imams made, but from outside the tradition, looking at a Christianity that had already, in its mid-19th century German, Lutheran, Hegelian form, lost its prophetic edge. He never met a living prophetic religion. He didn't know there was one. That is not a failure of his intelligence. It is a failure of the religion he was looking at to be what religion is supposed to be. We do not claim Marx. The material metaphysics that follows the diagnosis is not ours, and it never will be. But we do not pretend his critique was foolish. We do not allow the cheap clipped version of that famous sentence to stand in our communities any longer. Marx, and this is perhaps controversial, but please listen carefully. Marx was almost with Imam Husayn on the diagnosis. He just couldn't see far enough to find the alternative. Next, we look at Fanon in the body of the colonized. So Marx's diagnosis was European. Fanon's was something else. It was the diagnosis applied to the wretched of the earth, to the colonized, the dehumanized, those whom empire had reduced from subjects to objects. Frantz Fanon, born in Martinique in 1924, raised a Catholic, schooled at the Lycée Schola under Caesarea. He fought with the Free French in the Second World War. He was wounded. He was decorated. He came home to find that the empire he had bled for would not see him as a Frenchman. He was trained as a psychiatrist in Lyon. He was posted to the Blida Joinville Psychiatric Hospital in colonial Algeria in 1953. And there, day after day, in his consulting room, he saw what colonialism did to the colonized. He saw it in their bodies, in their fractured selves, in the wounds that no diagnostic manual had a name for. He resigned in 1956 to join the Algerian Liberation Movement. He died of leukemia in Bethesda, Maryland, on the 6th of December 1961, 6 weeks after dictating the final pages of The Wretched of the Earth to his wife. He was a mere 36 years old. And what he wrote in his last 6 weeks of life still shapes how the world thinks about colonization. His central claim, and we should hear at least one passage carefully, he writes, and the references of course are in the write-up, at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. Hear what Fanon is doing here. He is not theologizing violence, rather he is diagnosing it as a psycho-political rupture by which the colonized, who has been reduced to an object by colonial dehumanization, recovers his standing as a subject. It is psychiatry, not theology. It is ontology, not jihad. The colonized has been turned into a thing. And we see this in Technicolor in Palestine. The act of resistance is the moment in which he becomes a person, a human being again. And this diagnosis is closer to ours than most Muslims realize. The Quran too knows that the dignity of the human person is recovered through standing, that prostration before God is the only standing that matters, but that prostration before tyrants is the loss of a station God himself bestowed on the children of Adam. In Quran, Surah Al-Isra, the chapter of the night journey, 17th chapter of the Quran, verse number 70, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we have honored the children of Adam. The verses commanding resistance to oppression, of course, this is Surah Al-Hajj, 22nd chapter of the Quran, verses 39 to 40, often misused by people who know nothing, less than nothing about Islam. And this verse, of course, is from Surah Al-Hajj, chapter of the pilgrimage, as I said. Those who are fought against are permitted to fight because they have been wronged. And God is indeed able to help them. This is important, those who were expelled from their homes unjustly, only because they said, God is our Lord. Had not God repulsed the people from one another, ruin would have befallen the monasteries, the churches, the synagogues, and the mosques in which God's name is much invoked. God will surely help those who help him. Indeed, God is all-strong, almighty. This is the prophetic echo in an earlier register of what Fanon was articulating in the language of psychiatry on a desk in Algeria centuries later. But Fanon stops where Marx stopped. The recovery of agency in his frame is exhausted by the act. There is no transcendent anchor. The colonized becomes a subject through resistance, but the subject he becomes is the subject only of history, only of the body, only of the political moment. And history alone, the body alone, the political moment alone, these are not strong enough to hold what a witness is for. There's a second danger Fanon does not address, perhaps could not address, because he died before it played out. When violence is the only path to selfhood, The violence does not stop when selfhood is recovered. The 20th century is full of revolutionary movements that began as the recovery of the dehumanized and ended as the dehumanization of those they then ruled. You have Algeria after the coup. You have Cuba after the firing squads of La Cabana. You have Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. We can name what he could not. Like Marx before him, Fanon made the same diagnosis our own prophets and imams made, but from outside the tradition. He saw what colonialism did to the human being. He saw that the human being had to recover. He just didn't have the vocabulary that could anchor the recovery in something history could not take away. That vocabulary was sitting in Persian in a book that had not yet been written on a desk in Tehran a few years away. Dr. Ali Shariati, may God rest his pure soul, born in Mazinan in northeastern Tehran in 1933. He was at the Sorbonne in Paris from 1959 to 64, exactly the years in which Fanon was finishing The Wretched of the Earth and dying in Bethesda. The same Paris, same anti-colonial fire, same intellectual milieu, same questions. He had read Fanon. He had read him deeply. And we have to be careful because there's some folklore that's grown up around the relationship between Dr. Shariati and Fanon. Both are wrong, and we should say so honestly. The first, that Dr. Shariati translated The Wretched of the Earth into Persian. He did not. The actual translator's name was hidden by an editorial decision. And that they exchanged letters, they did not. The careful scholars Davari and Safari in their 2022 essay on the Shariati-Fanon engagement concluded that the letter exchange was almost certainly invented by Dr. Shariati for rhetorical purposes. And Dr. Shariati was, by his own admission, an unreliable narrator who liked to invent characters and exchanges to dramatize points he was trying to make. He was a polemicist. This was his way. So how did Dr. Shariati actually engage with Fanon? He read him on the page. He thought against him. He carried his arguments into his lectures at the Husayniya Irshad in Tehran in early 1970s. And in those lectures, he offered the move that completes what Fanon could not complete. Listen to the move. Fanon told the colonized, to recover yourself, you must act. Recovery is the act of resistance. And he was right to a point. But then Dr. Shariati made the corrective. The recovery of agency from within history alone is not enough, because history itself is under the same sky. The colonized, the wretched, the dehumanized, they are also, the Quran reminds us in Surah Al-A'raf, the verse we covered in the second night, the verse of the covenant, they too are the inheritors of that primordial covenant. They are the souls who were asked before the body was even given, am I not your Lord? And who answered, yes, we bear witness. That covenant was made before history, and it cannot be exhausted by history. It anchors the human person in something history can never take away. And here the redirection of Fanon, because this is the spine of this point. Fanon's violence is an imminent necessity. The colonized recovery of agency from within history. Dr. Shariati's martyrdom is a transcendent witness, the believer's covenant with God that history cannot exhaust. The way I would put it, perhaps in our own words, the shaheed does not simply die for the people. The shaheed dies before God, with the people, for the people, and in the people all at once. This is what is missing from Marx. This is what is missing from Fanon. The transcendent anchor that prevents the sacrifice from collapsing into mere loss. But listen to how Dr. Shariati himself put it in his own voice from the pulpit of Husayniya Irshad in Tehran in the autumn of 1972. And this is, of course, the references are in the write-up. This is from his well-known famous lecture titled Martyrdom, Arise and Bear Witness. He says, Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, the heir of Adam, the successor of the great prophets who taught mankind how to live, has now come to teach mankind how to die. In our culture, martyrdom is not a death which is imposed by an enemy upon our warriors. It is a death which is desired by our warriors, selected with all of the awareness, logic, reasoning, intelligence, understanding, consciousness and alertness that a human being has. Martyrdom, to arise and bear witness, in our culture and in our religion, is not a bloody and accidental happening. Listen to what Dr. Shariati is doing. He says that martyrdom is not passive suffering imposed by the enemy. It is active testimony chosen by the witness. The exact architecture we have traced thus far all the way from Abel to Imam Husayn. He's refusing every account of martyrdom that treats it as an accident, as a tragedy, as a misfortune that befalls the witness. In Dr. Shariati's reading, which is actually the Husayni reading, the Shaheed, the witness, the martyr, is not a victim. The Shaheed is a chooser. The death is not imposed, it is willed. And if it is willed in his own list of words with awareness, logic, reasoning, intelligence, understanding, alertness, the full faculty of human consciousness brought to bear on the moment of giving the body to the cause. That is what is missing from every secular witness the 20th century placed on our shelves. Marx, Fanon, Che, Bobby Sands, not because they lacked courage, we honor them, but because the vocabulary they could anchor that consciousness in is something history could never reach, something that history could never reach, something they could anchor the consciousness in, that history could not break, was not on the table when they were looking and where they were looking. The vocabulary of the covenant, the vocabulary of, am I not your Lord? Yes, we bear witness. Now let me try and offer a metaphor, and let me be clear that this metaphor is mine, not Dr. Shariati's. You have two axes that meet in the witness. You have the vertical axis, the covenant with God that history cannot reach. And you have the horizontal axis, the solidarity with the wretched that the prophets have always demanded. If you cut the vertical and only the horizontal is remaining, sacrifice without an anchor, which the 20th century saw devour its own children over and over again, that is the trap that Marx and Fanon tragically could not escape. You cut the horizontal and only the vertical is left, faith without justice, which is the kitchen and shoes Islam Imam al-Husayn went to Karbala to refuse. That is the trap our community had walked into in the decades when the wretched were looking for an answer. The Shaheed, the witness, is the figure in whom both these axes meet. That is the Husayni paradigm in Dr. Ali Shariati's grammar. And it is the answer to Fanon that Fanon could not have given himself, because the prophetic religion that would have given it to him was not on the table, tragically, when he was looking. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the witness that history cannot exhaust.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى
So the spine of this second point in 3 names and 3 moves. Marx diagnosed dead religion from outside the prophetic tradition. He had nowhere to turn after the diagnosis except to history. Fanon applied Marx's diagnosis to the colonized, added the dimension of psychopolitical rupture, gave the wretched of the earth the most rigorous account of their own condition that the 20th century would produce. He had nowhere else to turn except to the body. Dr. Ali Shariati received both, took what was true in each and added the missing piece, the transcendent anchor, the covenant with God that history cannot exhaust. The progression is honest. Nothing was wrong about everything. Only one had the missing piece. We don't claim Marx and we don't claim Fanon. We grieve them. because the candle they could have followed was not yet lit at the moment they were looking. And we honor the partial truth in each of them, as the Quran honors the partial truth in every prophetic figure who came before its final revelation. We are not in the business of diminishment. We're in the business of completion. The witness in our tradition is the figure in whom the diagnosis of every age, Marx's, Fanon's, Imam Husayn's, finds their answer in a single body, on a single afternoon, on a barren plain in Iraq. Imam Husayn carried what Marx could not carry. He carried what Fanon could not carry. And he carries what every secular witness in the centuries that followed could only point at and never reach. He carried it because the candle was lit and the lamp was raised and the oil was the oil of the prophets all the way back to Adam and Abel. That is what a witness is. And that is what is missing from every secular sacrifice the 20th century has placed upon our shelves. So now we move on to the third point of the night, and this is the most difficult to land in our own moment, because this is the one that asks something of us, not just of the figures that we've been discussing. The mid-20th century did not happen in a vacuum. The wretched of the earth were caught between two materialistic empires, the Soviet bloc on one side and the American on the other, each pulling every third path eventually into its own gravity. Vietnam, Cuba, Algeria, Egypt, all caught sooner or later by the gravity of one empire or the other. The Cold War was the field on which the secular revolutionary tradition was built and constrained. Every secular liberation movement of those decades had to ask itself sooner or later, which empire are you with? And whichever answer it gave, it had brought its place in someone else's calculus. This is why so many of the iconic faces of 20th century revolution, Che Guevara on the t-shirt, Fidel Castro on the dorm room poster, Nelson Mandela on the wall, Bobby Sands in the Belfast stencil, became in our own communities, especially in our diaspora, the faces we admired without ever asking what their cause was for. Today, the borrowing lives in algorithmic iconography. Posters become profile pictures, causes become aesthetics, and the covenant is replaced by the scrolling. We borrowed the iconography of secular martyrdom because we had no living iconography of our own to admire. And we had no living iconography of our own because we had not lived our own theology. The kitchen and shoes Islam had filled every mosque, and the candle had yet to be raised. And the youth of the diaspora and across the Muslim world met the t-shirts and the posters and the keffiyehs draped over revolutionary figures whose causes they had never examined, and they reached for what was on offer, because what was being offered in the prayer hall was frankly not enough. We don't mock these figures. They had real causes. Bobby Sands and the H-Block hunger strikers in 1981, 66 days of hunger strike. He was 27 when his body forgot how to live. Nelson Mandela, 27 years on Robben Island and Pollsmoor for his refusal to accept the apartheid state's legitimacy. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were real opponents of the empire's brutality in the Caribbean and the Cone of South America. Honor where honor is due. But we ask, of every face we have admired in our youth, the diagnostic question this whole series has been building. Was the cause anchored in the covenant with God or only in the will of history? If only in the will of history, the witness is closer to a tragic loss than to the candle of society. The candle of society burns by the oil of revelation. Without the oil, the wick can still be set alight, but the light goes out when the wick is gone, and the room returns to the darkness it was in before. The trap is real. We have admired their faces without asking what their cause was for, because we had not yet learnt to admire the face that asked the question and answered it correctly. And the face that asked the question and answered it correctly was right there in our own caravan on a plain in Iraq 1400 years ago. We just hadn't really been told. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, under the leadership of Imam al-Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, was the first major mass movement of the modern age to refuse both Cold War poles. Not align against one, not align with the other, and not align with one against the other. Not play one off against the other. Refuse, categorically refuse both. As we say, na Sharqi na Gharbi Jamhuriya Islami. Neither East nor West, only Islamic Republic. This slogan was not a piece of theatre. It was a very precise theological refusal. The Soviet bloc offered one form of materialism, the materialism of class, of historical inevitability, of the man without God. And the American bloc offered another, the materialism of capital, of consumer choice, of the man whose horizon ended at the shopping mall. The Islamic Revolution in Iran said in the vocabulary of the prophets, neither. The refusal was only possible because the candle was lit. Without the candle, every third path in the 20th century that had been attempted had been pulled into one of the two materialist gravities. Every secular, non-aligned movement was eventually pulled in. Only the Islamic Revolution held and continues to hold, and may it continue to hold forever. Not because of Iranian exceptionalism, but because of the candle. The wretched of the earth, who had no Islamic revolution to look at when Fanon was writing in 1961, had one to look at by 1979. Fanon did not live to see it. Some of those who admired Fanon did. And some of them began in their own lives the turning this whole night has traced from the will of history toward the covenant with God, because there was at last a candle to turn to. The candle of society, Shaykh Mutahhari's candle, finally rose to the height of its lamp. Let's now look at La Ikrah fi Din, how a witness persuades. So how then does a witness persuade? If we have the candle and others do not, what is the believer's task? The Quran answers in 3 words and 1 verse. In Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, 2nd chapter of the Quran, verse 256, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "There is no compulsion in religion. The truth has been made distinct from error." No compulsion in religion. The candle illuminates, it does not compel. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and his family and righteous companions, did not force conversion. The Imams, peace and blessings be upon them all, did not force conversion. The witness in our tradition is performed by the example of the life lived, not by the demand made of others. That is the methodology of what we call bayan, of tabyin, of clarification. And the structural opposite is the takfiri counterfeit, convert or die. Daesh's or ISIS's convert or die is the structural opposite of Islam, not its excess. We will, God willing, dismantle that counterfeit fully in session 9. And here is a parallel discipline I want to leave you with. Honor without conflation. The methodology we built in session 5 applies to events as much as it applies to persons. We refuse the conflation of Imam Husayn with witnesses outside our tradition who got it partially right. We equally refuse the conflation of Imam Husayn with events that share none of his architecture. The victims of the Holocaust did not choose their fate. The master of witnesses chose his fate. To equate the two, as some have tried, is to violate both. To shrink Imam Husayn to victim-shaped suffering and to grant the Nazi machine a power over a witness it never possessed. Imam Husayn was not a person who could be destroyed. said Zainab, peace and blessings be upon her, in the court of Yazid, looked over what had been done to her brother and her sons and her caravan and said, I saw nothing but beauty. And that single sentence forecloses any equivalence or equivalence that the equivalence makers would attempt to draw between Karbala and any catastrophe in human history. The Holocaust was a tragedy. The pogroms were a tragedy. The Nakba is a tragedy. Karbala was a victory. The Master of Witnesses chose his sacrifice, and his sacrifice cannot be diminished by any tyrant or by any catastrophe, because the choosing was already complete before the swords fell. The equation of Karbala with the Holocaust is sometimes offered from our pulpits as if it were a kindness to one tradition or both. It is a kindness to neither. It diminishes the unique theological station of Imam Husayn, and it trivializes the specific historical horror of the murder of the Jewish people and the millions alongside them. We trust Imam Husayn to land on his own theological terms, and we refuse the borrowed iconography in every direction. The chosenness of the believer is performed in how we treat the other, the Christian Palestinian, the Jewish anti-Zionist, the secular revolutionary who never had a candle to follow, the kitchen and shoes Muslim who has not yet seen what we have seen tonight. We extend the hand, we light the candle, we trust the candle to do its own work. That is what the Shahada of the life looks like in our day. From the verse from Surah Al-Hujurat, the chapter of the chambers, 49th chapter of the Quran, verse number 13. O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other. Indeed, the noblest of you in the sight of God is the most God-wary amongst you. Indeed, God is all-knowing, all-aware. We are made into nations and tribes that we may know each other. This is not a decoration. This is the operating manual for the believer who has just understood what chosenness actually requires. So a pact between this night and tomorrow. 3 options. Each person takes the one that fits your state. The first, find one secular revolutionary whose face you have admired without examining. Bobby Sands, Che Guevara, Mandela, Fanon himself, Fidel Castro, whoever. Read the actual life. Honor what was real in their courage. And ask the diagnostic question. Was their cause anchored in the covenant with God or only in the will of history? Number 2. If you don't want to do number 1, then take number 2. Take one of the 3 houses that we visited tonight. Pick the one that disturbed you the most. The houses being Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Study with kindness the period in which the house's prophetic root went quiet. Not in order to indict, but to understand. The understanding alone is its own kind of repair. Or number 3, find one person in your own life who has gone elsewhere because our house had nothing to offer them. A cousin, a friend, a child, a spouse who stopped praying because the prayer had stopped speaking. Do not bring them back with arguments. Bring them back with a hand. Be the candle. Whichever option you choose tonight, take it. The point is not necessarily to choose well, just to agonize about which choice you make. The point is to choose. Please give me a salawat and we look at the road ahead.
اللهم صل على محمد.
So tomorrow night, the 7th, we move from Europe and the Cold War to the colonial world's other great 20th century question, Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, the political theology of anti-colonial liberation. The merit and the limit of mass sacrifice in a national cause, as opposed to a covenantal one. And the Maqtal will carry Abbas, the son of Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, the standard bearer, the water carrier, the loyal brother whose hands were severed and who held to the standard with the other until that too was severed. The perfected anti-colonial witness, because his standard was for the proof of God, not for any flag that could one day be folded away. That is tomorrow. And before we move to the maqtal, just one question to carry home. As I've said before, but just to reinforce. When you've admired the face of a witness who was not anchored in the covenant, like I said, Che on a t-shirt, Fanon on a syllabus, Mandela on a wall, was your admiration the recognition of a partial truth, or was it the substitution of a partial truth for the full one? The partial truth is real. The substitution is the trap. The candle gives off enough light to see the difference. Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, never reached for diminishment. He honored every witness who came before him. David, Solomon, John the Baptist, Jesus, peace and blessings be upon them all, even as he gave his own life to the witness only he could give. The proof of tabyin is whether the lamp gives off enough light that a stranger can come closer, not enough heat to drive them away. Tonight we lit the lamp. Tomorrow, God willing, we will tend to it. But before tomorrow, tonight is not yet finished. Tonight's maqtal carries 4 figures woven together. All 4 were born facing the right direction. None of them had to turn. All 4 walked into the dawn of Ashura because the family had walked there and because the family was the right family. The first was Qasim ibn al-Hassan, peace and blessings be upon him, the son of the Imam who had been poisoned in his own house by his own wife, Ja'da bint Ash'as, whom Muawiyah had bribed with false promises of marriage to Yazid, the nephew of the Imam who was about to be slaughtered. 14 years old or thereabouts, still in the body of a boy, still close enough to childhood that his uncle was holding his hand on the night before Ashura when he asked him the question that would seal his place in the chain. The second, Ali al-Akbar, the son of Imam al-Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, the eldest son of Imam Husayn, 18 years old, who resembled the Messenger of God so closely in face, in voice, in bearing, that to look at him was to remember the grandfather none of the family had stopped grieving. None of the community had stopped grieving for. When he asked his father's permission, his father looked at him and saw the Prophet looking back. And the third and fourth, Aoun and Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them, the 2 brothers, 2 sons of Abdullah ibn Ja'far al-Tayyar, peace and blessings be upon him, the sons of Sayyid Zainab, peace and blessings be upon her, the sister of the Master of the Witnesses, who walked them by the hand to her brother's tent the night before Ashura and asked him to receive them in the place their father, kept in Medina by infirmity, could not stand in. Aoun the elder, the one who flies, reciter of the chapters and verses of the Quran. Muhammad the younger, the half step behind brother, who would not be parted from his brother on that last morning. 4 boys, 3 farewells, 1 morning, 3 mothers, Sayyid Ramla, Sayyid Layla, and Sayyid Zainab. Tonight we will not tell their stories one after another. Tonight we will braid them. The asking, Qasim's, Ali al-Akbar, Sayyid Zainab's, told side by side. The going out, Qasim alone, Ali Akbar alone, and the 2 brothers together because they could not be separated. The falling, and here the parallel breaks open into difference, because the 4 bodies came back to the camp very differently, and the difference itself preaches. The bringing back, the orphan child gathered in pieces by his grieving uncle. The perfect resemblance borne whole by his weeping father. The 2 brothers carried side by side in the uncle's 2 arms back to their mother, laid in our memory, all 4 together at the edge of the tents. Revolutionary youth die for an idea. The youth of Hussein die for the proof of God. That is the difference, and that is everything. The voice that carries our maqtal across the series, the Imam of the age, may our souls be his ransom, may God hasten his return, comes to us tonight from behind the veils, for all four of them. The opening cello carries one note. Four stories begin. Let us listen. Peace be upon Abel, the first witness of the earth. Peace be upon every witness in every tradition who refused to bow. Peace be upon the horrors of every house. Peace be upon Qasim and Ali Akbar and the two brothers, Aun and Muhammad, who never had to reach because they were born holding it. Peace be upon Husayn, the master of witnesses. Peace be upon the Imam of our age. May our souls be his ransom, and may God hasten his return. Peace be upon the candle that no Cold War can put out, that no empire can blow out, that no diaspora can mislay, that no kitchen and shoes Islam can extinguish, because the oil of that candle is the oil of the prophets, all the way back to the first witness, all the way forward to the witness who has not yet come. O God, we have nowhere to go but your door. You are the one who made us into nations and tribes that we might know one another. You are the one who made covenant before you made body. You are the one whose justice, adl, is the principle of your being, by which a chosen people is a people of responsibility and never a people of position. O God, send your blessings and peace upon your last messenger, Muhammad, and his family and his righteous companions. Send your peace on the prophets of every house, on Adam, on Abel, on Noah, on Abraham, on Ismail, on Ishaq, on Moses, on Aaron, on David, on Solomon, on John the Baptist, on Zachariah, on Jesus the son of Mary, on every one of them whose names we know and whose names only you know. O God, tonight we have brought into your presence the souls of the wretched of the earth, who reached for what was not yet on the table. We grieve them, O God, and we name them. Frantz Fanon in his early grave at 36 in Bethesda. Karl Marx, who diagnosed dead religion and died not knowing the living one. Che Guevara, whose body fell on a Bolivian slope in 67. Bobby Sands, who went hungry in the H block until his body forgot how to live. Nelson Mandela, 27 years on Robben Island. The young Algerians, the young Vietnamese, the young Cubans, the young Lebanese and Palestinians, whose names have not survived their own decade. We do not place them where you have not placed them. We do not raise them above their station, but we grieve them, because the candle they could have followed was not yet lit at the moment they were looking. And we ask you, O God, in your justice that exceeds our understanding, to weigh their lives by the light they could see, not the light they could not. O God, we honor the horrors of every house. O God, every soul in every age who stood at the edge of the choice and turned toward you, who refused to bow to tyranny, who gave their comfort, their safety, or their lives so that the oppressed would not be abandoned. Receive them by your measure, not by ours. O God, look upon the wronged and dispossessed of every land, those crushed beneath occupation and injustice, those who cried out for deliverance and were not answered by men, and be yourself their helper, for you have promised to aid those who are wronged. O God, send your peace upon Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah in the second Muharram since his own martyrdom on your road. And send your peace upon every name we will hear tomorrow night. We hold them tonight only in passing, knowing tomorrow is theirs. O God, the longer return is to Imam Husayn, the master of the witnesses, in whom every chain finds its completion, to his brother Hassan, to their father Ali ibn Abi Talib, the commander of the faithful, to their mother, Sayyidah Fatimah al-Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, to the Imams of guidance in the chain that runs from Imam Husayn to the Imam of our age. May our souls be his ransom, and may you, O our beloved Lord, hasten his return. O God, send your peace upon Qasim ibn al-Hassan, the boy who asked his uncle and was answered, and whose body came back in pieces, and whose witness came back whole. Send your peace upon Ali al-Akbar, the son of Imam al-Husayn, the 18-year-old, whose face was the face of the Prophet of God. And we ask you, O God, that the dawn that broke for them may break in its own way for every young person in this room who is still being asked which face to wear, which cause to die for, which idea to follow. Show them the face that has asked the question and answered it correctly. Show them Husayn. O God, in this Muharram, the first since the martyrdom of Imam Khamenei, send your peace upon him, the man who refused the East and the West, who lit the path for everyone who turned, who visited Christian martyrs' homes every Christmas, who held the line of honor without conflation from the seat of leadership for his decades of leadership, whose voice we still hear when we listen for it. Welcome him into your nearness, O God, with your prophets, your imams, your martyrs, your saints, and the truthful. O God, hasten the return of the Imam of our age. Make us of his helpers. Make us of his soldiers. Make us of those who, when he calls, are already standing. O God, we have nowhere to go but to you, and no one to ask except you, and no words enough except the ones you have placed on the tongues of your friends. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We belong to God, and to him we return. And we repeat your promise, an eternal promise for justice and a warning for the wrongdoers. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. And the wrongdoers will soon know at what goal they will end up. And we add, from the depth of everything we have learnt tonight, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil. God is sufficient for us, and he is the best of guardians. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. Wa akhiru da'wani alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.